Hey everyone, so earlier this week I had the chance to sit down with Ron V, the current writer of DC's Detective Comics, and also the forthcoming New God series that starts this December. Now, this interview was filmed as part of the Superhero Project podcast, where we also discuss Ram's work on Detective Comics at length, but I wanted to share with you an extended clip from that episode of us chatting about Ron and Evan Cagle's upcoming New God series and what you can expect from it. I'll leave links to the Superhero Project channel in the description, so do make sure to go and subscribe and check out the full episode when it drops, but for now please do enjoy this extended clip of us chatting about all things New Gods. That segues really nicely into asking you about New Gods, which obviously the first issue comes out in December.
Smooth.
I know. It's yourself and Evan Cagle and a series of guest artists on the series. I've been really curious and excited for this series ever since it was first announced back. Was it San Diego Comic Con? It was first formally unveiled. And what you just said there about kind of challenging and reconfiguring status quo is really interesting. Because even already, just from the All In special, it's very clear that your New God series is going to be in a very interesting place for the Fourth World characters, because Darkseid is off the table. And I was listening to your interview with John Suntress, and you talked about this idea of like, well, what does it mean for all of these characters, for Highfather and Orion and Metron and Scott and Barda? What does it mean for them to exist in this kind of ecosystem of the Fourth World without one of these kind of major pillars in Darkseid? So even like before the runs even started, you're already tackling this corner of the DC universe in a very unfamiliar place. I was interested in hearing about what your initial pitch was for New Gods and how it ties into things like All In and the Absolute line and kind of Darkseid's death and resurrection, how that fed and tied into your interpretation and your approach for this series.
My initial pitch for New Gods happened long before any of the All In and Absolute stuff was even on the table, because I think about 3 San Diegos ago, so maybe 2021, I think I was at a breakfast meeting with the then group editor at DC, Ben Abernathy, and he was like, so what do you want to do after Detective? Because I had just started on Detective, but he was like, yeah, great. So what's next for you after this run? And I went, well, I want to pitch you a huge, sprawling idea that brings the Fourth World back into relevance and contemporary context for DC readers, partly because I knew that Detective was my time on this sort of bigger, well-known character. Everyone has expectations as to who Batman is and what he should be doing, et cetera, et cetera. But I also really enjoy taking on characters no one's seen in decades and going like, cool, can we now look at these in a completely fresh way for completely new readership as well? And so I knew that the next phase of my DC writing had to be me doing these kind of obscure characters. I wouldn't call New Gods obscure,
Well,
but
compared to Batman,
certainly, compared to Batman, and also certainly in terms of contemporary relevance to what's happening in the general DCU. New Gods tend to be these kind of, oh, they came from far and showed up for like 10 pages and did something and then went away. Whereas I wanted to tell a narrative where they were very much sort of embroiled with the day-to-day conflicts of the DCU. So that's where my pitch came from. And then obviously I was aware of where Kirby was taking his inspiration from for writing things like New Gods. He was drawing from Greco-Roman mythology. He was drawing even from other parts of the world. There were references to East Asian mythologies there. So I said, everyone knows Indian mythology is this thing, and everyone, sees it from afar and goes, these are like strange six-armed gods with elephant heads. But the thing that fascinates me is that the big difference between, to me, between Indian mythology and more Western mythology, if you will, is that in Indian mythology, the gods are not meant to be exemplars. They're not meant to be things you look at and go, oh, I should be like that. No, if anything, if you read Indian mythology, even these tales of gods are cautionary tales in terms of like, this god was proud, and so this happened to them, and so you should not be proud. And so I wanted to bring in some of that because that makes for much more interesting characters to write and also much more interesting stories to tell, in my opinion. And so I wanted to bring a piece of that mythology. But I didn't want to bring in like, hey, suddenly there's an elephant-headed god running around with Orion or whatever. So I brought in the underlying structure of the end of the world myth from Hindu mythology. So the Hindu version of a Ragnarok style myth, if you will. And then specifically within that, it says the last avatar of God is yet to be born on earth, but one day he shall awaken when this kind of great darkness comes over. And I'm gonna say something that I don't think people realize how much of these comics that they enjoy are taken from already taken from Hindu mythology. So the idea is that, and this is not just Hindu mythology, it's a prevalent idea across multiple mythologies, but the Hindu mythology literally calls it the Great Darkness, right? So the Great Darkness existed first, there was nothing, and then there was light, and it shattered the Great Darkness. Now, the light is quite literally the source from Kirby's original mythology. The Great Darkness is, everyone knows the Great Darkness in DC. But then here's where it starts getting weird. So according to Hindu mythology, the darkness was shattered into 6 pieces. Where else do we know that the world's darkness has been shattered into 6 stones that now people must collect somehow?
You're blowing my mind here. This is fascinating.
Wow.
And then the idea, again with Hindu mythology, is that the last avatar of God will manifest to fight off one of these 6 pieces of the great darkness. Now, if that does not sound like a big superhero set piece, I don't know what does. So I said, I'm going to bring that idea and I'm going to put the new gods on top with that and say, great, what if the last new god was to awaken on Earth? And then there are interesting pieces with that version of the mythology where it says, in Hindu mythology, this last avatar must meet 7 immortals who have lived on Earth for all of time. And these 7 immortals must each give him one gift that he will then use as an instrument in his final battle. So my pitch to DC was, great, what if the last avatar is a new god? And he must meet 7 immortals of the DCU, and each of the 7 immortals must give him a gift, a power, that he will then take to fight off whatever approaching great darkness exists. That became the underlying framework of a very long and sprawling story, out of which we are telling the opening with this New Gods run. Obviously, the advent of a prior unknown new god now showing up on Earth means New Genesis doesn't know if this new god is of Apocalypse. Apocalypse doesn't know if this new god is of New Genesis. And so they're going to react to this information in unexpected ways.
I think you touched on this. I think you touched on that in the interview with John Suntress that I watched, where you mentioned that obviously this is an apocalypse that has kind of lost its pillar in Darkseid. Might be looking at this child as this kind of like savior for their people, and it might be New Genesis that take a more kind of cautious approach.
So in Hindu mythology, there's a character called Narayan, who I'm named after. And Narayan is this very sort of low-key kind of figure in that he's very knowledgeable, eventually a good guy, but I would be very suspicious of that idea. But Hindu mythology is rife with stories of this guy going around and meeting various gods and saying like, oh, last Wednesday I met this other god and he said this thing about you that I found very interesting. And then he'll go meet the other god and be like, just yesterday I was talking to that other guy and he reacted really poorly to me just mentioning that you said this. And then he will just sit and watch these two gods collide and the worlds be destroyed. And he'll be like, isn't that amusing? So to me, Metron has already been written as a character very much like that. Um, and so at the very beginning of this narrative, Metron goes to New Genesis and says, well, there's going to be this new god that's going to come up. And let me tell you, High Father, everything is going to change. And Highfather looks at Metron and goes like, oh, that doesn't sound very good. And then he goes to Apocalypse and he says, well, there's this new god showing up on Earth. Like, it's funny, isn't it? When Darkseid goes away, somehow suddenly a new god shows up on. I wonder if he's just the universe's way of replacing Darkseid. And then Apocalypse goes, oh, yay, the second coming of our savior is here. So yeah, and that has consequences and that has repercussions, obviously.
Absolutely fascinating because it kind of like flips the dynamic of those two worlds in a sense, where kind of one is kind of on this kind of desperate quest to kind of retain its place, and the other is taking a more kind of cautious and standoffish approach. I'm really excited to see how that unfolds throughout the story. In regards to
I
talking
mean,
about
without giving too much away, I don't think New Genesis is going to be very cautious either, because there are things happening there. And then, of course, we have not accounted for the fact that Darkseid, who was such a strong presence in this corner of the cosmos, suddenly doesn't exist. And so there are things from beyond our knowledge and our sight that have gone like, oh, that Darkseid fella's gone. I wonder if we can start moving into that part of the universe now.
Yeah,
So,
I think that idea of kind of Darkseid being the kind of universe's kind of guard dog, and now he's gone. What things at the kind of furthest ends of the cosmos are kind of staying away from the fourth world because of Darkseid being there? It's that idea of kind of like the fourth world kind of being this perfect ecosystem, and then when you take one of these pillars away, what then happens? Not only the ecosystem itself, but what from outside can come in. I think that's really, really fascinating. I saw you shared some of the artwork of some of the new antagonists on Twitter yesterday. Can you explain a little bit more about the kind of villains we can expect in this series?
Again, without giving too much
Without
away,
spoiling too much, because I don't want you to spoil it for me. I'm
let me
excited
put
to
this
dive in.
conceptually. Yeah, let me put this very conceptually. If the new gods are the source empowering creation with itself, so they may act in its service, if you will. If the source did that, then surely the great darkness that was shattered will find a way to do the same.
Yeah.
Will say, well, great, I'm going to empower some other people who are manifestations of my power. And so far, Darkseid has been this force of balance between them, because even though technically Darkseid is still a new god, so he's still powered by the source as well.
Mm-hmm.
And even though he's looking for the anti-life equation, even though he's rebelled against the source in his own way, he is still a new god. What if if you were looking at Highfather and Darkseid as two ends of the spectrum, you're going, Highfather's good guy, Darkseid is bad guy. What if the spectrum is twice as long as you thought it was, and Darkseid's just the middle? So that's
It's like you talked about that idea of kind of in the kind of context of Gotham. Is Batman inherent or is he a design flaw? It's a similar situation with Darkseid here, where it's like he is an antagonist. He has done all these monstrous things, but the fourth world is
he's an
designed in a
antagonist by
balance.
design.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah,
when you take
exactly.
that out, what does it mean for not only the kind of shifting power of the fourth world, but what can be let in his absence? I think that's
Yeah,
something I'm so fascinated to see unfold in the series.
yeah, yeah. So the only thing I'll say beyond that is the antagonists are called Nictari, which comes from the word nict, which is I think the Latin root for night. So darkness associated characters, if you will.
I'm really, really excited to see all of this unfold. So one of the things that really caught my eye about this series, and we've talked about the kind of the birth of a new god a lot, so let's kind of dive
Mm.
into that specifically, is the introduction of Live Free, a name that was too good not to use, I assume. And
Yes.
something that Kirby himself would be very proud of, and a little bit jealous he didn't come up
Good.
with.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that.
So one of my all-time favorite comics of the last 10 or 20 years was the Mr. Miracle limited series that Tom King and Mitch Gerads did. I think that
Mm,
is it's probably in my top 10 graphic novels of all time. I adore that series.
sure.
And
Yeah.
one of the things that I found it so powerful that I didn't think had really been explored in length until that book was kind of this idea of re-examining Mr. Miracle through the perspective of fatherhood and generational
Mm,
trauma, and how through the birth of his son Jacob in that story, he learns to
mm,
overcome his own, or doesn't overcome his own trauma and kind of the things he's been through in his life. I think that was
mm,
a really insightful series for me when I first read it in 2017. And so when you announced that you were also going to be kind of an in continuity version of that, where this kind of Scott and Barda have live, I was really
yeah.
interested to hear kind of how you're going to handle those characters in particular, Mr. Miracle, Big Barda, and Liv, both in terms of like the large scale prophecy and all of the kind of inter-universe conflicts they're going to be having, but also the kind of small scale character studies they're going to be going through as well.
Yeah, look, I think any story, it's great to say like, oh yeah, worlds collide, universes explode, but eventually that means nothing. Like
Yeah,
me watching the universe explode on a panel does nothing to me. Um, so the stories in effect have to be about real people and real people concerns in some way. And so that's why it's very important for a story to be driven by a character's concerns rather than a reader's concern for the plot, if you will. And Scott and Bart are very much part of that sort of, okay, let's zoom all the way in and look at what the universe exploding means for two people trying to raise a child.
mm-hmm.
Um, so that's kind of they're part of that lens. I will also include Orion in that equation because actually all of the sort of big prophecy stuff is set into motion or sets into motion these two characters into acting. Actually, it sets into motion Orion first, and then Orion, for reasons, sets into motion Mr. Miracle, and then Mr. Miracle, for reason, sets into motions Big Barda, and that kind of tumbles into a more nuanced human level conflict and climax of its own. So while big worlds are exploding in the background, big worlds are exploding inside the interiority of these characters in the foreground, if you will.
Absolutely.
In terms of Scott's sort of fatherhood and it's my reflection on my own fatherhood kind of finding its way in there. Um, my approach to it is more of I never had a father in the classical sense. This is Scott talking. So Scott says, I never had a father in the classical sense. So I don't know how to do any of this.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm probably going to be terrible at it. And it's going to make me a nervous wreck. And I'm going to be worrying all the time. But this is the first time I don't want to escape from something that makes me feel uncomfortable or causes me pain or causes me fear. Um, and so that is, cathartic for him that he's now confronted with this thing that he doesn't know how to contend with, and yet he feels no reason to escape. And then what happens when something else comes into that ecosystem and says, I need you to leave all this behind because I have this other thing that you need to go do. Um, Obviously, Scott's reaction is, no, I'm a father now. I'm not going to go away on some adventure. And then I suppose the reminder to him is like, yeah, great, but what will you be able to look your own child in the eye and say your father is someone you should be proud of if you don't go do this thing?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, there's questions of responsibility, parenthood, how to value yourself as well in that relationship and that equation. And then, of course, the whole Scott and Barda thing of yeah, sometimes, I think in that relationship, Scott's the one who needs support more often than not because of his childhood and his circumstances. And then what better support to have than like someone who's quite literally can be big for you. So yeah, I love playing that relationship in with that sort of chemistry as well.
Yeah, honestly, that's utterly music to my ears. The Scott and Barda
Same.
relationship and those two characters are. I think I said that Reed and Sue, Fantastic Four, are my favorite couple in comics, and then Scott and Barda are a very, very close second.
Mm.
So I'm already like massively excited to see kind of all the large scale stuff, like you said, but knowing that there's
Yeah.
still this incredibly personal and emotional crux of the story within
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
with these two characters is just, it sounds perfect to me. It's everything I'd look for in a New God series.
Excellent.
I
So no
honestly can't
pressure.
wait for it.
I don't know, no pressure at all. I'm enjoying it. I was quite literally talking to Evan, who's drawing pages
Mm.
from the issues, and I said, I think we're making something special here. Like I think even we can tell when we're working on the pages that this is going to be very cool.